I actually feel like the opportunity for an LLM is to scale a content designer so that you can now take on projects as an organization that you would never do before because you would have had to hire 100 people.
In this episode, we dive into how content design is changing in the era of GenAI with Trisha Causley from Shopify.
So in a deterministic product, you wouldn't ever say to a user, hey, this answer could be wrong. So read it closely, right? We don't need to warn users that it could be wrong. We don't tell them, hey, if it seems weird, run it again. Try again.
We discuss why Trisha went from being an AI skeptic to an AI champion, what types of content tasks GenAI is actually capable of, tactical lessons for leveraging GenAI across product experiences, and why prompt engineering must become a part of your toolkit. We talk about Shopify's plans to leverage GenAI to scale and personalize brand building, and why generative AI enhances the role of creatives by expanding what you can do. This conversation is a deep case study in what the capabilities of the technology are today, but most importantly, how product teams have to leverage both creative experts and these emerging technologies side by side. Trisha Causley is a senior staff content designer at Shopify in Toronto, Canada, where she works on AI-powered product features. She previously worked on the Watson team with IBM.
Standard LLMs, they're not tied into marketing metrics. So what they're doing is they are looking at all the content in the whole world, and a lot of it's bad and ineffective, but it doesn't know that. Like, it doesn't actually know what works and doesn't work from a human perspective. In fact, the more bad stuff there is, the more it's going to be trained on it, right?
In Design of AI, we interview leaders and practitioners at the forefront of AI to help product teams navigate where and how to best leverage AI. Please subscribe to Design of AI, the podcast for product teams, wherever you get your podcasts: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or Substack. You mentioned you started as a skeptic. When did you start believing that AI was going to help content writing?
I feel like people's initial reaction, especially content folks, if you ask an LLM to write something, you're going to get something back maybe that's not great. And you're like, this is useless. I can do better than this. So I feel like when I was really pushed to get high quality content, because we were working on a project and you can see where you can coach the tool to do better. I think that's where I saw, oh, okay, so it's not that it can't do it. It's on me to coach it and sort of externalize what I know or what I believe to be best practices so that it can do a better job. It helped me see the possibilities of generated content, but also my role in how, to bring that about, how to get that higher quality output.
It sounds almost like it has allowed you to shift from copywriting to copy design or content design. Is that accurate?
You actually are forced to sort of be really explicit about your intentions with any content in a way that you're doing it when you're writing. You're thinking, why am I writing it? Where do I start? What's the best way to say this? And instead of you actually doing the typing, you're broadcasting or you're instructing the LLM to do what you were intending to do. And there's a lot of iterating and coaching that goes on where you say, that's actually not quite right. I want to emphasize this more. I want it to be shorter, which is what you would be doing if you were doing your own editing, right? You'd be changing things in that way. So it's almost like I know that it's a bit cliche to say that it's an intern. I feel like we're kind of bashing interns a bit when we say that. We say it's an unskilled intern. It's more like you brought your niece or nephew to work with you and they're pretty good, grade 12 English students, but they're still like learning. So what kind of tasks would you give them if they're sort of really keen and happy to do things over and over again and they don't get discouraged and you can ask them to do tedious things over and over again? I feel like if you see it that way and you're just using them for those kinds of tasks, I feel like that's a better way to approach it than it's going to actually do my job for me.
So you've been playing around with it for a little while now. How are you leveraging AI now? Or what have you found it's best at for you?
So we use it a lot. So we're a very AI forward company. Thinking about something you would do that's very repetitive that you could describe it in words and you can just get the AI to do it for you. As an example, reformatting things. So if somebody gives you a list and it's not in the format that you want and you want to paste them into a spreadsheet, but you you have a document with titles and descriptions in one row. The LLM's actually really great at separating those things out and giving it to you in a format that you can then cut and paste. I use it for that all the time, sort of side of your desk things that would be annoying or small style guide things. The bane of a content designer's existence is being a capitalization or comma police. Just give that to the LLM to do, write a little prompt with some style guide stuff, and you can just get that cleaned up in seconds, which is really nice. And if it doesn't do it right, you just say, do it again. You missed this. So again, it's like that student where you're like, they're here anyway, and they're here to help. So just give it to them and give them something to do, and then you save yourself that time. So those are sort of productivity things, but we also use it for I actually feel like the opportunity for an LLM is to scale a content designer so that you can now take on projects as an organization that you would never do before because you would have had to hire 100 people. And so it's not that you're going to get a ton of content, it's that you can take one person's sort of expertise and scale it. So, for example, we had a project summarizing app reviews in our app store. You could just have, like, hey, summarize all the reviews if you wanted to. But we wanted to have a feature that was very intentional. We had ideas about what would be a valuable sort of piece of a summary. How would a summary be structured? What kinds of things would people find interesting about other people's reviews? How should the information, the content sort of be laid out? We would never be able to take that project on if we had to hire an army of content people to read through reviews and summarize them. But we knew what we wanted. We knew that this would be a valuable feature. And so having an LLM to sort of unlock that, you still need the content person. We're the ones saying, this is what this piece should look like. And by the way, here are the instructions in the prompt. You can turn your expectations into instructions that go into the prompt. You do the testing, you do the evaluating, and then you're done. And you don't have to do the reading through all the reviews and typing every summary. So it's like you're scaling your brain or you're scaling your ideas. And I think that for content people, that's what they should be looking at, the things that you would do if you had a ton of assistants or 100 hours in a day.
I like that idea of if you had 100 hours in the day, what would you do differently? What has been then the most impactful improvement that you've had with your newly found 100 hours in the day?
We often don't have the time to sit back and be analytical and think, what is the best practice that I'm putting into play here? Because we're just doing the work. So you're just like sitting down and doing stuff. So if someone asks you to edit something, you try to explain why you're making certain edits, right? If you have time, probably many people don't care. It's quite time consuming. And it's also something you're going to do every piece that you edit or every time someone brings something to you. It gets tiresome for you, probably also for the recipient. So oftentimes, if you're stuck for time, you just make the changes. You just make them. And then tomorrow you're making those same changes. And then tomorrow you're making the same changes. When you're working with an LLM, you're forced to be externalizing and making explicit those things. It gets you to reflect, like, well, why do I do that? Why is that a better way to say that? And so it lets you think more critically, but also at a higher level about the work you're doing. I'll give you an example. The other day, I had a product manager. This is also my favorite thing is when people come to you and say, I got GPT to write this. And I'll say, I know, I can see that you got GPT to write this. You just asked it to write it and you didn't tell it anything else. I can tell that because you're getting this weird default thing. So it was a changelog entry. And he said, can you take a look at it? And I looked at it and I thought, I could just rewrite this, or I could give you back a prompt. So the next time, GPT is very, I guess it's trained on a ton of marketing content and very salesy and very like hard pitch generic content. So it doesn't know that a change log needs to be something very scannable. It should be something that's like you don't say things like, "We're excited to announce this new API," right? Should be a little bit more just straightforward facts. So GPT just gave this weird, "We're excited to announce this new API starting on this date." I could have just rewritten it, and a year ago, I would have been like, "Okay, well, let's change this, let's rewrite it." Instead, what I could do is sort of do it at a meta level, look at some good examples of changelog entries, drop those into a prompt, and say, "Okay, this is what this thing should look like." So that is a really powerful thing that you can now do, because now I'm not saying that tomorrow that PM is going to write great content, but it'll be a lot better. And so it's sort of saving your brand, right? Because you're not getting this garbage going to the getting published, but it's also saving your time. I feel like you get way more credit for having given someone a reusable prompt than doing the edit.
This Design of AI episode is brought to you by PH1 Research, an innovation research consultancy that specializes in turning business questions into product decisions. Over the last decade, PH1 has helped client teams discover, conceptualize, and test product improvements and net new ideas. This has included executive briefings about how to leverage AI and researching which specific use cases and tools your customers want. PH1 has worked on projects for Spotify, Microsoft, the National Football League, Dell, Mozilla, Bell, and various health and higher education groups. With capabilities across product discovery research, service design, rapid prototyping, and in-market testing, PH1 has been a key ally of product and product marketing teams. Visit their website to book an intro call, www.ph1.ca.
It
So
sounds like the most impactful part of better leveraging AI is kind of twofold. From one perspective, it's changing the way that your role interacts with and sits within these other teams. But then, secondly, it also sounds like you've really learned that providing examples and frames for the prompts and for the LLMs are giving you significantly stronger outputs then. So you've really sort of shifted the way that
mm.
you're thinking about the prompts and the way that you're using these technologies from a content perspective, and training kind of each instance as well. Is that correct?
It's interesting because I feel like I don't wanna pretend the output that's getting generated is not what a professional content writer would write. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it can be like, "Yep, that's indistinguishable from, like, a skilled, writer." But it's better than what would have been, written by the PM initially or generated by the LLM without any instructions. So you're kind of bringing up the level, like, across the board to a mediocre, passable level, and I feel like the promise of, "Hey, we don't need writers anymore. We're gonna just get the LLM to write everything." I feel like the danger is that is so easy to do. It would be very easy for an organization to say, "All of our content is now generated content." It would be a terrible thing to do, but if you, as the content person, could say, "Hey, wait a second, if you're gonna go down that road anyway, having this sort of generated content, then let's at least be the architect of, like, we can get it to a B minus level instead of the really abysmal stuff that would go out otherwise." And it's kind of interesting because I don't use it that way. Like, I might say that I'm way more likely to write my own stuff. To me, writing is sort of thinking, and so it's easier in some ways to clarify my thoughts if I'm like writing it out. Some people, though, they just get stuck. So I feel like there's a difference maybe between a writer and a non-writer and how they use those tools. I would use it for something like, I've got 5 things I'm going to talk about. Have I forgotten any? Like, you can ask the LLM and it'll sort of help you brainstorm, but I wouldn't necessarily get it to draft copy for myself.
We've had a lot of episodes with designers and some product managers talking about how the process has changed, the way that you look at product. A lot of it was thinking about AI as a new material that you can work with, obviously a new assistant you can work
Mhm,
with, but that conceptually a lot of them are needing to move a level up in terms of how they think about the outputs.
mhm.
That from a design perspective, they need to start thinking more from a service level or more strategically about the implications of the design. What are you seeing for content designers specifically?
If you are a UX writer today working on AI projects, it's very interesting. So, in a deterministic product, you wouldn't ever say to a user, hey, this answer could be wrong. So read it closely, right? So if you imagine you're doing something where you've asked for a result from a database, you expect the same result every time. We don't need to warn users that it could be wrong. We don't tell them, hey, if it seems weird, run it again, try again. We don't need to coach people the same way within the UI about what they need to put in to an interface. People are pretty good at using search. So they know, like, hey, these keywords, when I put these keywords in, I kind of know that that means it's going to match something in the back end. But with generative interfaces, we're having to rethink about how much we're exposing to the user that this is an AI, first of all, that we're working with, not from a bragging standpoint. Like sometimes it feels a little bit like, hey, you want to put the sparkly magic everywhere because everybody it looks so great that your product has AI in it, but more of a almost a warning, like this isn't like other tools in that you won't always get the right output. You need to read really carefully what it's generating. You need to sort of be a little more critical than you would be from a standard app. We actually have to put a bit of skepticism into the interface to say things like, check the work, don't publish it. We do things like highlight anything that's generated so you know that a human hasn't seen this, which is very different from how I think you interact with other interfaces where you trust results and you trust outcomes. If you've got a tool that lets you generate a blog post, so how do you make it so that a user kind of knows what the LLM is capable of, what they need to do to sort of get better results, like how many keywords to provide. When we first went out with one of our products, people didn't understand that they didn't have to write in the text field the actual instructions. They didn't have to write a product description or write a email tagline. They just needed to put the keywords in. So how do you sort of teach them what we're taking care of and what they need to do? How do you encourage them to try again and like keep going? People are very worried once they get some output that they're going to lose it. So they would like copy and paste it, put it somewhere, not knowing that it's kind of free to generate, but like, so you'd want to give people a sense of like, there's like 4 versions here. You're not going to lose them. You can page through them, but keep going because you might get something better the next time. So that's again a very different sort of concept for people using an interface. Like keep going because you're going to get something better is so strange. Like I would not expect in Google to run a search 5 times and get like completely different ranked results every time.
Yeah. I'd love to understand where the writer sits in the cycle of leveraging it. Are you responsible for how someone interacts with all language and all content through a model, or are you coming in after the fact, after models have already been trained? What is the evolving role of content designers now that language is such a critical piece of the infrastructure?
Well, you kind of fall into it if it's going to be a text-based output, like if it's the feature is giving someone text, like let's say we're labeling something for you, or we're generating a marketing email, or we're generating a product description. It's the natural space of the content person to say, what does a good output look like? What are the characteristics of a good output? It's not too long. It doesn't repeat itself. It follows whatever tone guidelines are set. So you kind of have this image of these best practices. You're saying, where are we headed? And then the natural flip side of that is to say, okay, well, how can we get there? Well, we need to turn those expectations into instructions for the prompt. So that's how I started doing prompt engineering, is saying, okay, here's what we need to get to. And so here are the steps to get there. And, kind of going back and forth and tuning and seeing where are we actually hitting those criteria, where are we missing. And that is sort of the best model that I can see, where you're releasing this feature, you sit down, you basically, with the product manager, you say, okay, what are the product requirements? But then what are the quality requirements for that output? And then those turn into instructions in the prompt. So a lot of content designers at Shopify will actually be writing prompt instructions. We don't write the Python code, but we will often prototype those instructions and say, can the LLM do this thing? Here's me trying it out. And then the developer will turn that into some code. It's kind of interesting because, again, this is new to me, but I'm actually sometimes in the actual code once they've taken my sort of text-based prompt and put it into Python. And there's still a lot of English in there. So I can actually go in and say, there's a problem that we're getting some strange output. I think it's because the prompt looks like this. The content role actually, it lends itself really well to a lot of the troubleshooting that you'll see. Like, you're getting weird output. Let's say you've got an LLM that's doing something that you're not expecting. Oftentimes you can, as a content designer, just look at the instructions and say, well, it's because this is ambiguous, or these two words are being used in two different ways. So I'll give you an example. We were generating some content that's like was a summary, like their answers about that were based on our help center, but we didn't want the LLM to talk about the help center. We didn't want to say, well, the help center says this. So in the prompt, it said something like, don't reference the help center. But then earlier in the prompt, it said, for all of your answers, reference the help center, like go and get your information from the help center. So we're using the word reference in two different ways. One of them is go and get it, use the help center documentation. And the other one is don't mention the help center. And so it was getting confused. You're saying use reference and then don't reference in the same prompt. So changing those words to be more precise actually got us better output. So that's a very strange thing because it's code, right? And so for the language experts to be driving a behavior change is it's kind of empowering, right? It feels very like, hey, I actually fixed this weird bug with language.
That's similar to what we've been hearing from designers, where they're basically saying that they're responsible for a model being accessible, useful, impactful. So they're not only designing the visual interface now, they're designing the way in which someone interacts with data. And that's something they never had access to
Mm-hmm.
before. Now, flipping that conversation, Shopify is in a unique position because basically brands have to trust you. They onboard into your platform and such. But as a growing body of data and content, how do you think about UX given that Shopify is basically this collection of brands? Does it change how you think about content now that you quite literally can personalize it for all these different brands?
We actually lean into that, right? Because we want to let merchants express their brand. And so any AI tooling that we provide has to allow that flexibility. So, having done a lot of work on tone of voice, letting merchants choose the tone of voice that they use across their store for any generated content is super important. We're releasing features with imagery and background so that you can come in and you can pick a style or iterate on a style so that you get to something that reflects your brand personality. And then that becomes sort of a configuration for everything that you generate in your store. So I feel like that's actually a good thing because we have a sense of like, hey, if you are a playful brand, then here are the ways that that should show up in your product descriptions and in your About Us page. We've actually had merchants respond really well to that sort of picking, really narrowing in on a brand personality. I feel like makes them go, yeah, actually, we are experts. That is the kind of store we are. And so like there were great merchant quotes about this one merchant that was like, yeah, that's me, we are this. And they actually really anchored on the label that we'd given because we sort of said, here are the set that you can draw from. So it's going to be even more important for you to have a explicit understanding of what you want your brand to sound like so that anything that you generate sounds different from other people and not the default GPT.
Yeah. So we know that LLMs in particular can help these small or medium-sized businesses that don't have a lot of people on their team or necessarily marketing knowledge. But when it comes to enhancing that idea of brand voice, like how can these companies or these products do that? Like, how should they be better using LLMs? How could they be training it on their brand? How do they make sure that it aligns?
Mm,
Because, it sounds like a big task to people who
yeah.
aren't familiar with it.
Training is a different thing because right now you'd be all using the same sort of base model, but it's the instructions that are going to the model that are different for each generation or each merchant. I feel like if I were a merchant, I mean, obviously, I would pay a lot of attention to the content and making sure that I really read anything that's generated, that I really ask myself, just because it's here doesn't mean I have to accept it. I should probably run this like 4 times, see which one's the best. We actually have some of our interfaces where we do sort of show you 3 options at once so that you can sort of go, "Oh, it's hard to imagine until you see it in front of you which thing is the best." But if you see 3 subject lines, you can sort of say, "Oh, that one sounds weird." But if you saw it in isolation, you might, like, be like, "Yeah, that's fine. Like, it's better than I can do." There's a lot of better than I can do's out there. I feel like what we really need to do is encourage merchants to be thoughtful and work it until you have something that's actually working for
How
you.
have you found user response to be for tools like that, where they can look at a comparison, or where you are providing more of that kind of like, hey, triple check this, it might not be correct? Because this is obviously a very different mode of
Mm.
creating content than people have been used to.
Yeah, it's funny because I think that was one of the biggest risks that I identified early on is that if people aren't confident in their own content skills, or they're just like, wow, look, it just seems to know so much about my product. And so they might publish it. That was for me one of the things that kind of scared me the most, is that people aren't even going to read these and they're going to publish them in the store. And so we need to make sure they're really, really, really good. And so we actually built, I wouldn't say it's friction, but we worked really hard on the prompt to make sure, first of all, that it actually gives very concise product descriptions, and things tend to be concise because that's actually a tip, that's a trick to keeping GPT from overwriting and hallucinating, is just restricted. And then if you want more, you can get more. So there's a little bit of friction there for someone to like say, I want a little more details. We're going to start small and make sure it's high quality. And then you can add to it if you want.
Shopify seems uniquely positioned because you have all these AI product companies desperately looking to deliver value,
Mhm.
and they're trying to convince people there's value. But I'm assuming that 90% plus of your merchants are solopreneurs, right?
Yeah.
And that these tools are probably empowering them to do things that they never could have imagined to do. And that there's a very, very clear value offering on that.
Mhm.
It must make your job easy to actually convince them, like, this is helping you.
Yeah. I mean, so we started with things that we knew merchants struggled with. So that's one thing, is like, don't just add a feature that people don't need. We could actually measure, for example, product descriptions is one of the ways that, it helps with SEO. There's like a ton of reasons to have them, but a lot of merchants just didn't have them. And I think they just got blocked. We released this feature and you could see, like, there was, I can't remember what the numbers are, but like immediately people could see the value and they were like, these are pretty good. Like, I had nothing before and now I have this, and my pages aren't empty and I'm getting SEO. And we've had people who said that they had used services before but been disappointed, and it's a hassle because you have to send all your product information to them and they have to send it back and then you have to add it into your store. This is all there for you. So I think that making it in part of your workflow, and it's something that you either found difficult before but that you need, I feel like that those are the places that we've been adding those features. What are the things that is really tough to do and, you gotta sit down and do it, versus something I can now just press a button and review? I think that we've had really great adoption from our features because of that. I mean, even the
Yeah.
GPT, if you think about using ChatGPT, which a merchant could totally do, they could go and use the public version, they could write, but then they have to come up with the prompt and they have to paste the stuff back. And this is like all there for you, which I think that's kind of an easier sell.
I just think you're the perfect use case because you actually have the top to bottom tooling,
Mhm.
you have all the data, you have all the commercial channels at the disposal of these people. But when we look at other corporations, we spoke to somebody from Klaviyo, we spoke to people from Spotify. The reality is like there's a line where they just don't have the capabilities beyond that line.
Mm,
And as a result, the data is not as useful as it is for yours.
mm.
Are there any lessons that you think you might have from being one of these ahead of the curve type organizations that perhaps could help these other ones that are feeling a little shackled by not sure how to leverage this technology?
I feel like it's one of the things I would say we've done really well is by really democratizing the AI across the whole company. We're all encouraged to use it. Every time we have a hack days, there's hack days where people come up with their own ideas. It is shocking how many people, just all parts of the company, how many of them use AI in their hack days projects and are really embracing it. And I think what that does is unlock in the organization, like what is possible? What would be something that we could do today that would really help my segment of the population? So I'm not sure if other organizations are doing that, but that I think has been really helpful. Is I feel like there's a base level of understanding that is in the back of everyone's head from our HR people. They all kind of have a sense of, hey, I can just go and try this thing out. And I can ask someone in my org and they will help me like look at my prompt or whatever, or tell me how to get the API key to our local model. Like all of those things, I think have really made it so that it's a fire hose of possibilities all the time.
Well, it seems like getting the most in terms of productivity games is the function of the culture. And we've heard this repeatedly, and we're seeing data that basically states there's a lot of enterprises in particular that are intimidated to have their employees even use the
Mhm,
technology. Meanwhile, they're trying to in parallel build out tools. And as a culture, that's a mismatch, it's a
mhm,
misalignment. But meanwhile, the organizations where we're seeing some quick gains and some clear advantages that are brand building are ones where their values are distilled from top to bottom. Like Airbnb is one of those orgs that has been really pushing it from top to
mm,
bottom. When we heard from Klaviyo, they self-admittedly are not even an early mover on this, but it's become a core part of elevating and moving their business forward.
mhm,
So I commend the fact that you and your team are encouraged to leverage those tools because that's probably going to leak out into new advantageous ways of leveraging the
mhm.
technology. But looking at that from the perspective of a content designer, have you seen anybody really trying any intrepid things that make you think that content design is going to move into this new era where content's going to be respected in a new way?
I feel like I can see why people are worried because it's so easy to just get content. But I see a world where curators, uh, you're going to need experts because there's 400 blog posts. How can you make yours one somebody wants to read? Because at some level you can say, well, you know what, it's fine, it's content. But I'm like, at some level, people can feel the quality and they can feel the genericity, if that's a word, of content. And so at some point, you're just going to lose readership. You're going to lose your audience if you don't have someone who's uniquely has the eye for what would make this better. I feel like there's going to be like a weird curve where people get rid of all their marketing people and then they say, oh, we can just do our own landing pages. Look, we can get these landing pages. And then all of a sudden there's going to be things are going to chug to a halt. And then you need to have those experts come back in and say, yeah, GPT comes up with a lot of stuff, but only like 5% of it is actually usable, and it still needs to change in these ways.
I want to shift gears for a second because you've mentioned a lot about GPT, but let's talk about some other types of tools that can be leveraged or are really starting to make headways in industry right now. So, for example, like how might an AI platform like writer.com change how product teams leverage content designers?
So it's interesting. We don't use writer.com, but I know of the product. We're way more at home built tools, that sort of thing. But writer.com is super interesting. And I think if I were a business that had a lot of content, maybe you don't want to write your own prompts, they actually will train a model for you on your style guide and on the brand voice and that sort of thing. It would almost be like outsourcing it, but like they work with you on doing that. I don't know what their process is, but I believe that's probably a really great tool for someone that doesn't have the in-house ability to write their own prompt.
What is Canadian English? Because sometimes I find it's situational. Sometimes you use S's instead of Z's, and
Yeah.
sometimes you use Z's, and then I'm very confused by what Canadian English is right now.
So Canadian English, we have a bunch of spelling oddities that are shared with the UK.
You were trying to mention about like organization with an S versus a Z or something, right?
But someone asked me what Canadian English is, just like we use metric sometimes, we use imperial
Yeah.
sometimes, and I can't figure out a logic of why we use one or the other sometimes.
So that's a style guide thing. So a style guide is just something that you pick, right? So I used to work for IBM. They had a very strict style guide. There's like American spelling, but then you would have things like people want to know what is right. Should you capitalize kilometer km or lowercase? Is it capitalized uppercase km or lowercase? That's just a style guide thing. So basically, you pick a lane as an organization, what size style of spelling you're using, or what kind of commas are you using. And so the right or wrong thing is very confusing. The question of organization, I will just tell you, this is just a random fact that in Canada, we use the Z, but in UK, they use an S. So Canada sort of has like a weird mix of stuff. But no one learns spelling anymore, so I don't understand what's gonna happen. Like, I guess the LLMs will be the only ones that know the differences between it'll be like a switch between Canadian and US and UK spelling. But, like, they have, like, jail. In the UK, they spell jail Gaol. So,
I'd love to know, what are some AI content tools that you recommend that product teams leverage? And conversely, when do you think they absolutely should be leveraging content writer rather than tools?
I'm not gonna be your best person because we don't use those kind of content tools. We do homegrown sort of content tools. I mean, Grammarly is great. So I don't have a license anymore, but it is really great. I would start there. I would say any org who's generating content, it's just a great copy editor. It doesn't just fix punctuation, it'll say, this is a convoluted sentence. Here's a better way to say that. If you are looking to learn, it actually teaches you as opposed to something that just goes through and fixes. It actually might teach you, hey, like maybe next time you
Sure.
won't have like a paragraph long sentence if you don't want me to correct you. um,
To that point about personalization, something we haven't really talked about is that LLMs can actually get us to a point that we're training the marketing content to be reflexive to what we want.
mm,
I wonder if it's something that's been explored over there, where if I react better to shorter emails, I only get shorter emails. If I respond
mm.
to content that's more colloquial or more story based versus ones which are very direct and jokey, like, has there been any speculation on some of these potential wacky uses of personalization?
It's funny that you say that because I would say that, okay, standard LLMs, they're not tied into marketing metrics. So what they're doing is they are looking at all the content in the whole world and a lot of it's bad and ineffective, but it doesn't know that. Like it doesn't actually know what works and doesn't work from a human perspective. In fact, the more bad stuff there is, the more it's going to be trained on it, right? That's the nature of it. Statistically, it's like, oh, there's a lot of people making this kind of content and it just says, well, humans must love this even though no one's actually reading it. So I don't know if they're going to change that. They're going to be like, oh, how do we make sure that like certain sources are prioritized over others? Like, I don't know. But you mentioned that the training part, like that's something that you would have to build yourself. Like if you were an organization that was doing email marketing generation, you're going to have to build in sort of the metrics, the performance metrics into your training set if you're doing that. I don't know if companies are doing that now. That's pretty advanced. It'd probably be easier, to be honest, if you said, hey, we have these metrics. Let's, like a human, look at them and say, you know what performs best? We've tested all of these. Now that we know these are better, let's make sure our prompts are doing the thing that works better and build that best practice back into the generation itself, as opposed to trying to teach the model what makes a
Yeah.
good email.
A couple of weeks ago, we had a behavioral scientist on, and she's an expert in AI. And one thing she talks about is that we can start looking at digital experiences not from the perspective of a target metric or a conversion, but you can start thinking about goals,
Mhm.
where the LLM can start learning where you actually want to get the person
Yeah.
to over the course of 100 interactions rather than a single interaction. And that some of these capabilities, once you unlock them, can turn brands into ones where you basically have 20 storefronts instead of one,
Mhm.
and that the possibilities of that could be really immense because you can really shift the personality of a brand and the content to one where it's like, okay, this person likes high touch. They don't like to be interacted too much. They like
Mm.
some fun little stories. Again, has anyone tinkered with the possibilities of this kind of longer future of LLMs?
I don't know, but it's basically if you can describe it and you can sort of flag it, then there's no reason why you couldn't get the LLM to respond to those signals, right? So I don't know why it wouldn't be possible. I think it would even be possible in a non-LLM model. It would just be really convoluted code.
Obviously, when you walk down a street as a customer, you make a decision based on what it looks like, what it feels like. Once you go in, you kind of have that sense of it's right. And as Shopify, you have this just powerful capability of making a storefront what you want it to be, and you can help people find it. And a specific example of this is search had been built off library sciences. It's about syntax. It's how you structure queries, right? But now with the LLMs, you can actually basically be like, well, I think the intent of this person was actually this,
Mhm,
and maybe we've been using the wrong wording all along.
mhm,
Maybe we haven't nailed down what they actually want to do, and we should be changing our strategy.
mhm.
And there's all these really creative possibilities that I'm fascinated about, particularly when we come to commerce, because commerce is always about where we want to get them to. And sometimes everything along the way is a vision with very fluid tactics.
Mhm.
That's at least how I feel about it.
Yeah, no, and that fluidity is what the LLM is really great at, right? It's responding in real time to how you're responding to something, right? Don't know personally, so if that's actually happening, but I mean, I don't see why it wouldn't.
It's probably not happening today, but it's one of these like speculative
Yeah.
futures. But on that note of things that are happening, obviously there's a bit of a dark sentiment around people in product and creative fields where they're really not sure about their job
Mm.
security. What advice you might have specifically for content designers about how they can adapt with what's happening right now, what they can focus on, how they can feel like they have a very positive trajectory.
Don't be afraid of the technology. I feel like learning its weaknesses is the best thing you can do because then you can see the gaps and the way that you can help bridge those. Those tools aren't going away. So, how do you say, well, it can do A, B, and C, but it can't do D, E, and F? I've tried it. I know I am able to do that, or I'm able to work with it so we can get to F. And I feel like the more you practice that muscle of evaluating and making explicit what's wrong with a piece of content and what is right is actually the key because ultimately you don't want humans to have to review every piece of content. So you want something that is an automated evaluator. Automated evaluation is so tough with content because everyone feels like, well, it's a feeling, it's taste, it's whatever. If you can sort of quantify the sort of attributes of good content, that makes automated evaluation a little easier, and that is your value add, is you're saying, "Here's what a fail is. Here's what a fail looks like. Here's what a pass looks like." That is actually worth so much to an organization, and so other people cannot do that. I I can't count how many times I've heard engineers saying, "Yeah, it's doing pretty good," and I'll be like, "It is not doing good. This and this and this and this, we need to go back and do more work on the instructions or on the input or the examples because this what you're seeing, let me show you how generic that is. Let me show you this is a little exercise. If you Google some of the phrases that GPT will use, like it loves to say, looking for a floor cleaning solution, look no further than blah. And you may see that the first time and be like, wow, that's great. That's great. It's better than I could write. And you don't realize that that's actually every third time it generates that. So the world is full of that phrase everywhere. And so you need someone that can spot that cliche or spot that sort of tired phrasing.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Trisha. It sounds like forever forward,
Mhm,
still the curator and the evaluator will be critical roles, no matter how smart the technology is. And
mhm.
it's good to know that good ads, good content are still going to have impact. We just might have better, crappy content now. I
Yeah.
don't know.
Well, there'll be a lot of it for a while.
But look no
Yeah,
further.
look
Here
no
is your
further.
vacuum cleaner.
Thank you for listening to the Design of AI podcast. The show is hosted by Brittany Hobbs and Arpi Dragvi-Guerrero. Subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, or Apple to get our latest episodes. We speak to leaders at the forefront of AI to learn how great AI products are designed and how they're transforming industries. To contact us, visit our website, designof.ai.